Welcome, everybody, to the virtual book launch for the new book, Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes, by Joan Growe with Lori Sturdevant. Tonight's event is hosted by the Minnesota Historical Society, Minnesota Historical Society Press, and the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. I'm Michelle Whitty, the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Minnesota, and I'm so excited to introduce Joan and Lori tonight. Joan Growe was Minnesota's Secretary of State for 24 years, from 1975 to 1999. Widely known as an expert in voting and elections, she has served as an official election observer in various foreign countries. Lori Sturdevant is a retired Star Tribune editorial writer and the author of several books about Minnesota history, including Her Honor, Rosalie Wall, and the Minnesota Women's Movement, also published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. And of course, we're here together on a very historic and still relevant day today, Minnesota's Women's Equality Day for the whole nation, marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which significantly expanded voting rights for women in America. As we commemorate this important milestone for both women's rights and voting rights, we also take pause to remember that Native American women in Minnesota were not yet citizens until 1924, so couldn't access the vote in 1920. And as we know, many people of color could not fully access their voting rights until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Knowing this history really helps us to understand both how far we've come, but also how far we still have to go to make it possible for all Americans to be able to truly turn out and access their rights. So what a great day to talk about Joan's book and story on such a relevant day. I'll begin by talking with Joan and Lori for about 30 minutes, and then we'll address questions from you, the audience, via the Facebook chat. This program will be archived here and on YouTube, so you may watch it again or at another time. So let's get going. We're going to look at our wonderful book. It's so exciting. I've read it cover to cover. So, Joan, I really want to get started, of course, with you tonight. I'd like to start with your thoughts about what makes Turnout really relevant yet today.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for all your work you do with the League of Women Voters. And I just have to say this publicly, Lori, thank you for your patience and your diligence. This book would not have happened without you. I could not have done this alone, I will tell you that. But turnout in elections is incredibly important, and it has been for years. And especially this year, when we see such calamity, I guess, in our country, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, it's an entirely new situation for all of us. And I think people need to take extra responsibility to be sure that they get their ballot, to be sure they apply for an absentee ballot if that's what they're going to do. And then once they get their ballot, send it in right away. I really have confidence in Minnesota's election system. I believe that we are going to go smoothly, but I think there will be lots and lots of absentee ballots, and you might not know exactly the outcome that is there on election night. Well, that's okay. It's better to be sure. It's better to get all those votes counted. And from the Secretary of State's office down through the county auditor, the city clerk, and the election judges, they want to help you vote. And so vote early if you can. Encourage your friends, your neighbors, your kids, your grandmas, your moms and dads, and help anyone who can and who needs it. Spread the word. I think that's the best thing we can do right now.
Thanks, Joan. Lori, that really does make it relevant for today, doesn't it?
Well, I don't think this book could be more timely. But first off, let me begin by thanking you, Joan, for the opportunity to help tell your story. It's a powerful story, one that will inspire, I'm sure, a lot of readers. Thanks, too, to the Minnesota Historical Society Press, which was a great help with getting this project to fruition. And thanks to the League of Women Voters and to Michelle. The League is certainly a big part of this, of the whole story, big part of Joan's personal story. And we're really glad to have you with us here, Michelle, tonight.
Great.
So Joan and I share a belief that high voter turnout is part of what has a big part of Minnesota's success story as a state. When a state experiences consistent high voter turnout through many years, the state's government has more legitimacy than would be the case were turnout low. There's more of a sense of participation and involvement. Government doesn't seem like some faraway alien force, but something that people have some control over. That means that government's more responsive to the people, more accountable to the people, can be brought up short, if need be, by the people when government it makes mistakes. I think that's contributed mightily to Minnesota's quality of life. So I think what we're talking about here, as we talk about keeping turnout high, how we kept it, how we got it high, how we keep it high, is really part of how do we keep Minnesota a strong and healthy state.
Excellent. Well, I want to go back just a little bit because, Joan, one of the things I loved about the book were the stories from your childhood. And I'm wondering if you can share some of those stories with us as a child and young woman when you were living in Minneapolis and Buffalo and Tracy. And those were formative years for you.
They really were. I was brought up in a small town, Buffalo, Minnesota, and my dad was the mayor in that town. And I used to watch him interact with people, listen to people. They'd stop him on the street and talk about some road project or something else. He'd be answering the phone. And he really was my role model for how government officials should act and work. He was in office for quite some time as mayor. And at the time, I did not know of or was not aware of any woman who served in any elected office. So I looked to my dad for leadership and guidance in that direction, although I had at that time no thought of ever running for office myself. It was the farthest thing from my mind. I went to college and was trained as a teacher. After college, I immediately got married and then almost immediately had 3 children within 2 years. I taught school. Well, I put my husband through his last year at what is now the University of St. Thomas. And then he went to 3 years of law school where I worked off and on. And we, struggled a bit as most college students do, I think, getting through college. So I was really looking forward to the day he graduated and the day he passed the bar exam, which happened. And then he decided that we should move to Tracy, his hometown. It was fine with me, although I didn't know anyone there. But we did do that. He set up a practice. And after about a year and a half, 2 years maybe, I realized that he was not the person I thought he was. He was an alcoholic. He was very abusive. I found myself in a position where there were no services for that sort of thing in this small town. And I don't think people talked about those issues very much. I remember being quite embarrassed about the whole situation and blaming myself in some cases. But eventually I decided for my safety and for the safety of my kids, I picked up and left and came back to the city. Well, I tried to get a job. My teaching credentials, I had not kept them up, so I couldn't get a job in the public school. So one of the good nuns at a Catholic school hired me. She gave me a huge sum of $300 a month, for which I still remember my budgeting. It was $125 for rent, $100 to the babysitter, and $75 for healthcare, dental care, groceries, traveling, whatever expenses we had. And so I was really eager to upgrade that teaching certificate. I ended up going to school nights at the University of Minnesota, did get the certificate upgraded, and was thrilled, just thrilled, when I got a job at the St. Anthony Public Schools starting in September. But there was one huge problem, and that is school ended in May. The public school didn't start till September, and I had no income through those 3 months. And I really didn't know what to do. Someone suggested to me that I apply for AFDC, which was Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And I had no choice, so I did that. And I thought to myself that it was the most humiliating, embarrassing thing that had ever happened to me. I'd never heard or knew anyone who was on AFDC, and they had you standing on the street with kids hanging on your skirt trying to get these bushels of grains of different sorts that I didn't even know how to cook. But I did it. I had to do it, and I got through it. But what I learned from that was that I believe that government is the only entity that is large enough and stable enough who can help people in a crisis. And so I got off as quickly as I could, became a tax-paying individual, and I think most people who have to go on public assistance feel the same way about it. So it was not a very happy period in my life, but I pulled myself out of that.
Well, I think that's all those early lessons. And of course, for you, I know with your dad being the mayor in Buffalo and just not knowing, gosh, am I going to be in public service? But then all of a sudden you fast forward to what I would say in the book is chapter 3. Of course, it's one of my favorite ones. It's chapter 3. I personally love is it starts by telling your story of joining the League of Women Voters and how this organization made a difference in your life. So I would love if you could fast forward for us now into those early years of the 70s when you decided to run for office.
Well, it was 1972 and reapportionment had occurred and our state legislator decided to run for the state Senate. So there was an opening in our district. And my league friends got so excited, and so did I. We said, oh, we've got to elect a woman. And then we thought about it and thought, well, the district's only about 25 or 26% Democratic. So we drafted Gwen Luda, who was president of the League of Women Voters. She stepped down from that role and sought Republican endorsement. Well, you can imagine how upset and angry we were when she didn't get endorsed. They endorsed some guy and he was fine, but it wasn't Gwen. It wasn't a leaguer. So people were calling me and saying, you should run. And I said, oh, it'd be silly. I said, you can't win. I'm a Democrat and I can't win in that district. Oh, they said, that doesn't matter. And they said, what you will do is you'll educate your opponent on all these wonderful League of Women Voter issues. And I thought, that's true, because we had lots of coffee parties in those days where both candidates showed up, lots of debates and lots of joint meetings. But I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't. The DFL convention is tonight. My husband, I was remarried by that time and had another child. My husband is out of town. I don't have a babysitter and I don't have a speech. Oh, not to worry, said a couple of the women. And sure enough, somebody showed up at my house with a babysitter. Someone else came over with the speech, and I went off to the DFL convention, the only candidate seeking the endorsement for that office, reading a speech that was written on recipe cards with the word Republican crossed out and Democrat written in. I gave Gwen Luda's speech to the DFL convention, and I got unanimously endorsed. They had no other choice, and went home after that.
I loved it when Joan told me this story. She said a few days later, it hit her what had really happened, and she called her good friend Gretchen Fogo, who said, I am in such trouble.
Yes, I did. I called Gretchen. I was just panicked because I thought, what do I do now? Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to run a campaign. My friends, Gretchen, and a lot of our league friends had been involved in a school board campaign on the periphery a little bit, and our candidate came in last. So it was like, what am I going to do? And I've told people that if I'd known that you could withdraw within 3 days after you filed for office, that's probably what I would have done at that point. But Gretchen said, don't worry, I know you should go door knocking every day, and I'll take care of the rest, which she did. So I door knocked every day from about 9 in the morning until dark. And of course, this is 1972. Most women are at home. Most women in our suburban neighborhood were not working at that time. We were fortunate enough that we didn't have to work. And Gretchen convened groups of women all over. They had a wonderful time in this campaign. They made all the decisions. They met a couple of times a week, had a babysitter, had snacks. It turned out to be the place to be that year in Minnetonka. And they had a great time. They decided what literature would go out, what it would say, what colors to use. They did everything. Well, I was still faithfully traipsing around knocking on doors. That's all I ever did, it seemed. And there a little excitement was being stirred up. And one of the television stations noticed that. And it was, I think, Karen Spencer, wasn't it?
Susan Spencer, yes.
Susan Spencer. And she called, she wanted to come out and interview me and my family at breakfast time. And then she was going to do the same thing with my opponent. And I said, oh, of course, we'd love it. So at 7:30 in the morning, I have all the kids lined up around the table in their best clothes, quiet, prodded to say, if you do this right, we'll go to the Dairy Queen tonight, whatever. And they were on perfect behavior. And Susan looked at me and she said, "Is it this way at your house every morning?" And I looked at her and I burst out laughing. I mean, I couldn't contain myself. So I don't know how it was at my opponent's house. I never did see that clip, but they played that a couple of times. And so the DFL started to get interested in my race. And one of the executives of the DFL party lived in my neighborhood. I had never met him, and I didn't meet him through the campaign. But one day there was a knock on my door, and I went to the door, and it was a young man who said, "Hi, I'm from the DFL party, and I'm here to help you." Well, I looked at him and I said, "Oh, good, come on in." I introduced him to the 4 kids, and I said, "You can babysit because my sitter is delayed today. I'm going door knocking." I never, ever saw him again, but he was helpful for that. Pretty soon, some of the men in the district got kind of interested because this was, as the newspapers called it, this was a housewives campaign. And that's exactly what it was, a housewives and leaguers campaign. And so the men started to call Gretchen or Nancy or someone on the campaign staff or even me, and they'd say, "Well, now we're willing to come over and do something." And Gretchen said, "Well, I'm sorry, but we've made all the decisions, and you guys can pound up the 4x8s if you like." So that's exactly what they did, and the women just said, "No, you're not getting in on the inner crew. We've made the decisions, we've done the work." And sure enough, I was elected, which I was shocked about, with 55% of the vote. But I tell you, I just thought about the other day, one of the things about that campaign that I've always felt was we always called it our campaign. It wasn't mine. It was these women, and it was us together. And from that, this core group of women who were so active went on to do all kinds of wonderful things. It was an empowering experience for women in 1972. Gretchen became a Methodist minister. A couple of the women got their doctorate degrees. One of them became a lawyer. One of them became highly involved in houses for sheltered women. It was an empowering situation. And to this day, we still call ourselves the Minnetonka Mafia. It was a great campaign in that regard. And one that you could never reproduce today because people are out working during the day, both men and women. So,
well, one of the things I really love about the book, in addition to these great stories, Lori, is your overview of history right alongside it. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about what was happening for women during these early 70s.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Joan really ran for office at a pivotal time for women in Minnesota politics, in the Minnesota life period. Minnesota had been a state that sort of kept up with the pack in the suffrage campaign, the movement that we honor today with our 100th anniversary celebration of women's equality and of the 19th Amendment. We were not in the vanguard in those years. We the women in Minnesota got the vote along with the rest of the country in 1920. But it was a different story as in the late 60s and early 70s as the women's movement, second wave, begins to quicken in the rest of the country, springing out in some respects out of the civil rights movement, out of the Vietnam War, anti-war movement, a sense that grassroots activism could make a difference in American life, changing society. The energy of the newly adult baby boomers contributed to that. The need for women to help that were parents of that generation to educate those kids contributed to them, and the need for workers in the economy began to open doors, professional doors for women. 1972 was kind of a breakthrough year with regard to electing women in Minnesota. Prior to that, there were, in 1922, 4 women elected to the Minnesota legislature. Some years after that, there were 3, then 2. In the late 1960s, 1 woman served in the Minnesota legislature, and it's not a coincidence that she was a former state president of the League of Women Voters. That was Helen McMillan from Austin, Minnesota. She was returned to the legislature in 1972 with 5 newcomers. And that was considered the women taking over. 6 women elected to a legislature of 201 members. Joan was one of those 6. And that was the beginning of something big. The number of women in the legislative body continued to grow for the next 2 decades after that.
Right. So, and the women who were running that year with me, the same year I ran, the other 5 women, I'd never met any of them until we were elected. So it was a little hard with just 6 of us. to think about taking over. But I will tell you, Helen was so happy to see other women there and not be all by herself.
Joan, one of my favorite stories is you telling me that on election night, someone approached the new House Speaker, Martin Olaf Sabo, and said, Joan Growe won in Minnetonka. And he said, who's Joan Growe?
They did not have our district on the radar, Lori. They did not, because it was a losing district. And it was just through that hard work of all those women that I was able to win that election.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And of course, then you get there. So then enter walking in with 6 out of 200 and so legislators. So tell us about some of those early priorities and some of those accomplishments once you were in the House.
Well, I'm proud to say that my first speech on the floor of the House was in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. I was also the author of the open meeting law. And I really felt strongly about that because I'd experienced as a league member observing local city council meetings that they made the decisions before they got to the council meeting. And the open meeting law didn't allow that anymore. And then, of course, this massive election bill came up. And I had no role to play in the formation of that bill, but I certainly voted for it. But it turned Minnesota around, I believe. It allowed for election day registration. It allowed for registration by mail, and it called for uniform registration around the state of Minnesota, which many areas of the state had not had registration. So I voted for that very happily and thrilled, because I thought, wow, this is the stuff we talked about in league. This is what I wanted to do when I was voter service chair. And then I was kind of appalled to hear that the Secretary of State, Arlen Ertl, who I did not know, but he's a really nice gentleman, did not know him. He was opposed to the bill. And in fact, after the House and Senate passed it, sent it to the governor, he urged Governor Anderson to veto the bill. Well, Governor Anderson did not do that, thank goodness, so that we now had brand new legislation that was to be implemented for the 1974 election. And I should just tell you one story about the House, if I have time to do that. Yeah. It was not geared for women. I mean, there were 6 of us, and some people knew Helen because she'd been there for a few years, but here came the 5 of us. We were different ages and shape. Linda Berglund was about 30 years old, I think, and Phyllis and I were around 40. And so we didn't look alike. We weren't friends, but the lobbyists and others kept thinking we were staff, or they'd say, oh, you're new here, never dreaming that we were legislators. And the structure of the Capitol was not meant for women because they hadn't had to worry about them. And one of the things that I came face to face with was in the retiring room. Behind the speaker's chair is a huge space that is the retiring room, and it's meant for all legislators to go back there. If you've been sitting on the floor for 3 or 4 hours and you need to take a break, you go back and get a cup of coffee or use the phone. There were no cell phones in those days. Use the phone to call home and say, I won't be home for another 5 hours or something. And there was a restroom back there, but it was a men's restroom. So I thought, oh dear. So the women got in the habit of, we'd go out the back of the chamber, down 2 flights of stairs, and stand in line often behind about 32 second grade girls. And I said, I missed a couple of votes trying to get out to the bathroom. Well, one day we had a call of the House, and that means that the speaker declares that everyone has to be present. They have to stay in their seats. They cannot leave the chamber. Well, I can't even remember what they were discussing, but anyway, I wanted to use the restroom. So I went to the back of the chamber and I was going to go out the door, and the sergeant at arms stopped me. And he said, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to the restroom. You can't do that. You can't leave without permission. I said, well, whose permission do I need? And he said, well, you need the permission of the Speaker of the House. I said, oh dear. And I looked up, and here's Martin Sabo with the gavel. And I said, well, do something. And so the sergeant at arms is making gestures at Martin, and he's, mouthing something, and I have no idea what it was. But pretty soon I saw Martin's face turn red when he realized what the request was. And out the back door I went to the restroom. But now I want you to know that with almost a third of the legislature women, that there is a women's restroom in the back of the chamber. So,
well, thank goodness we get some progress.
slowly but surely some progress.
Well, and I love that year, obviously, when we got same-day registration. And I know, Lori, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit, too. Another piece I really like, another thing I love about the book is the history of voting and elections that gets introduced throughout the book. So if you can talk a little bit about voting registration in Minnesota.
Voter registration has a long and not very pretty history in the United States. I believe it started in the 1840s in New York City as an effort to not disallow immigrants, recent immigrants, from voting, especially Irish immigrants back in the 1840s. By the period after the Civil War, voter registration became a tool of Jim Crow, trying to suppress the votes that were granted to African Americans in the 15th Amendment. That was a practice that continued way into the 20th century, as you know. A number of Midwestern states, Minnesota among them, were sort of suspicious of voter registration for those good reasons and did not have them. In fact, North Dakota to this day does not have voter registration. And in Minnesota, in much of the state, all you needed to do to vote was just come in and sign your name, sign a postcard, and you were eligible to vote. In the late 1950s, that changed in Minnesota. The feeling was that the area had become more urbanized and that in the urban centers, election judges might not know everyone who comes to the polls. So registration was required in cities with over 10,000 population beginning in 1960 election. Well, that meant that by 1972, the year Joan ran, about a third of the state had to be registered in order to vote. And if they showed up at the polls that year in 1972 without registration, that registration deadline would have already passed and they wouldn't have been allowed to vote. That was decried by Governor Wendell Anderson in the State of the State speech that year, and that was part of the impetus for switching to election day registration when we created the first statewide registration requirement in 1973. That was considered modernizing the election. Election day registration was really the key to the kingdom when it came to boosting Minnesota's turnout in all the subsequent years.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, of course, we have two more elections we have to get to. So moving along to one of my favorites, because I have a personal attachment to when you first ran for U.S. Senate in 1984, the first woman to run for U.S. Senate. You know, Joan, I contributed my $100 to your campaign. I got my Minnesota Growing pin, right? Your wonderful grassroots campaign. I was number 73,549. Contributed my $100. But I was so impressed as a young college woman then, and you were such a role model and remain that. And I would love to hear about what it was like to be another first for you, another woman running for U.S. Senate in Minnesota.
Well, Michelle, thank you for your contribution. $100 is a lot of money today, and it really was a lot of money back in 1984. So appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Well spent.
It was a first. I think there'd been one woman who'd run for a statewide office in Minnesota prior to my race, and there was the usual. Well, and Lori can probably speak to that. The usual sexist comments, but I think the story that it really tells you what went on is what happened at the DFL endorsing convention. And in those days, endorsement was key. I mean, endorsement, people usually stuck with endorsement. It was important. It meant the party worked for you. It meant they had funding for you. It meant in Washington, the Senate campaign committee would pay attention to you. So I really worked hard for that endorsement. And there were four of us in the race. There was former Senator Wendell Anderson, Congressman Jim Oberstar, and County Commissioner John Darris, and myself. Now, through the whole process, when I'm raising money up to this race, up to the convention, I had raised more money than any of the other candidates. I still got the questions from the press that said, "Are you sure you can raise enough money?" I kept saying, "But I have proof. I've raised more than the other guys. And are you sure you're strong enough?" And I used to say, "This is not an athletic contest. You know, don't question me on that." But we came to convention day and people are voting. And this convention was different than I believe any other convention the Democrats have held in Minnesota. there was no drop-off rule. And as far as I know, every other convention has had that drop-off rule, which means that as the voting proceeds, the people who are at the bottom drop off so that their voters go and vote for someone else. What you're trying to do is have one person come out of this. And we started on Saturday morning, and no one dropped out, even though Darris and Anderson both had maybe only 8 to 12%, and it changed a little. I was always ahead in the balloting, but Oberstar was close behind me. We went all day Saturday, all Saturday night. No one used their hotel rooms in St. Paul, and into Sunday morning. The party chair, Mary Monahan, called a meeting, and it's really the responsibility of the party chair to try to sort something like this out, to try to pull the candidates together, get them to do something that makes sense. So she said we should each bring one person in with us, and I took my young friend Ted Grindall, who had organized this convention, done just a beautiful job of running that part of the campaign. We went in together. Well, it turned out the other guys brought other people also, so that you were facing people like Speaker of the House, Martin Sabo, head of the AFL-CIO, Dave Rowe, a couple of heads of other unions, and important people within the party. So we all went into this meeting, and they looked at me and they said, well, you should drop out. And I said, wait a minute. I have more votes than anyone. I have consistently had more votes. Why should I drop out? Well, this went on, this haggling went on for a while in this back room. And the pressure was there because people were really suffering out on the floor. I mean, people hadn't been home, they hadn't been to bed, neither had we. So things get a little fuzzy then. And so finally, they said, well, all of you will drop out. Yeah, and so I said, I'll agree to that. So as we were leaving the room, the convention was taking, I believe it was the 18th ballot. And it pushed me a few points closer to 60%, which you needed, but not enough to go over. And it pushed Oberstar up a point or two. And so we all went up the microphone and said, you know, we made a pledge, I keep my word, I withdraw. And all of a sudden, Mary Ellen Tisdale, who was a delegate, stood up and said, Mr. Chairman, loud as she could into the microphone. She said, this convention does not belong to the candidates. This convention belongs to the delegates. And I move we cast another ballot. Everybody cheered and yelled and screamed. And so they cast one more ballot. And that was one that I gained enough votes, or enough percentage votes to ensnare the endorsement. And we weren't quite sure. By this time, I was in the back room with my wonderful staff, and some people were crying and others were, you know, all upset. I didn't quite know what to do. And George Latimer came busting into the room and he said, and I will paraphrase his language, but he said, Joan, get your body up on that podium and accept that endorsement. So I said, okay, I'm going. But I learned something. And I learned that it is dangerous for a woman to go into a room full of men because the outcome will not be pleasant. And it's a lesson I've carried with me for some time.
Oh, that's great. Well, Lori, you covered that campaign too, didn't you?
Well, I sure did. And I surely remember that convention very well, not least because I had a 10-month-old at home, a fellow who just had his 37th birthday last week. So, Joan, I remember so often you asked the question, what's it like to run as a woman? In fact, we even used that as the title for the chapter about the Senate campaign, because you're asked so often. And you and I both admired the answer that Patricia Schroeder, the congresswoman from Colorado, came up with 4 years later. I didn't know I had any other choice.
She was so clever. I was so sorry I hadn't thought of that.
That's great. Well, we've got only about 10 more minutes to get to all of the rest of the book, which is we're just teasing everybody to want to get this book. I can tell you that. But I want to get to your Secretary of State years, of course. We want to get there. And that's really your true legacy, serving for 24 years, Joan, as Secretary of State. And of course, the issues of voting in elections are still so relevant today. So if you could share with us, you know, kind of some tidbits from those years.
Well, I went back to the Secretary of State's office, and I will tell you one thing. I mean, losing an election is difficult. I knew that election in '84 was an uphill battle. But I don't know if my children realized it or my delegates or people who had supported me. And so I felt really badly for those folks more than myself, because I'd lived through much worse than losing an election, and that didn't bother me that much. But I do recall, and I have to say this because it was something I had really worked hard on, a couple of days after the election, the St. Paul paper had a story about it, and they said, Growe was the winner for women. And I thought, yes, now we've paved the way. Now someone will get in there. But it was 22 years before Amy Klobuchar won a seat in the U.S. Senate. So it tells you how slow we are. But back to the Secretary of State's office I went. I was exhausted, and I had a debt, which we took care of that. But I had a great team in my deputy, Elaine Voss, my office manager, Tom Durand, and my relatively new election director, Joe Mansky, who I really got to know in this period. And we said, okay, we're here. I'm not running again. I'm not going anywhere. Let's do big stuff. And we did. We computerized the entire office. We computerized all of the election registrations, and we were the first state in the country to have an online voter registration program, which we got a lot of kudos for. Joe and Tom and I actually were all asked to go talk to other states or to testify before committees to talk about that program. We also decided it was time to start pushing for a couple of election law changes. You have to understand that it's very difficult to change election laws because all of the people you're asking to vote for them think they're experts. They all got elected under the current system, and they're worried about what it will do to their chances to get reelected. Well, we pushed the idea that you should not have to have a reason to vote absentee. I said, we're making our citizens lie. Just take that away. Well, it took how many years, Lori, before that?
It was 2013 before absentee voting finally came into law in the state. That was, what was that, about 24 years after you first voted?
Yes. I mean, it is slow. I said it was slow. It took 24 years for that. And so then we decided, let's start talking about voting by mail. There were several states who had all mail voting in their states. Some of the progressive states, we were far behind in this regard. And I got permission from the legislature and funding to do a couple of test areas in the state. Well, they were so successful. We were just thrilled because the county auditors liked them, the election judges liked them, the public liked it. We took polls, and they cost less, and they had huge turnout. Oh, I thought this is a wonderful record to take to the legislature. They're going to be so excited, and they're going to want to improve it and make it larger. So I had a proposal that we would try it statewide for the presidential primary, which that year was held in, I think it was February or March or something.
It was 1992 primary, yes.
Yeah, and there was no one else on the ballot except it was the presidential primary. So this will be exciting. We'll have the results really soon, and Minnesota will be thought of as more competitive. Well, the House and Senate agreed with me. They said we could do that, but it went to Governor Arne Carlson. And at that time, election policy and election laws were extremely partisan, and it's only gotten worse since then. But it went to Governor Arne Carlson, and he vetoed it. And I went over and made a personal plea. I said, no, we've been waiting to do this. But he was getting pressure, I think, from Republicans and from some lobbying groups, and he needed to keep some of his Republican legislators happy so they would back him up and not vote the wrong way on issues he wanted. So that kind of happened to our big two wonderful areas that we wanted to make changes in, and we still aren't there with the voting by mail, although this year I think we're going to see from our experiences that more people are using the absentee voting. Lori, I don't know what you have to add. What did I forget?
Well, that is the case, that no excuses. Absentee voting is what's going to make a huge difference in this pandemic year. And it's one of the things that it has already been, I think, proving its worth through the primary election that we just had a few weeks ago, when more than half of the ballots cast in that primary election were cast via that mechanism of mail-in absentee voting. We're going to see a huge surge of that, but we are also hearing a lot of reason for concern right now, with concern about the post office having some slowdowns, concern about the impression that people are hearing from the president that there's something fraudulent about mail-in voting. There's no proof of that. The testimony we can offer is that because of Joan's work in Minnesota, some sparsely populated counties have been using mail-in voting exclusively now for about 30 years and have had no problems whatsoever with fraud. It's worked out very well. So,
in fact, excuse me, Lori, but in fact, there are 300 entities in Minnesota that vote exclusively by mail. Love it. They would have it'd be a revolution if we took it away from them.
Well, and if that were a problematic way to vote, we certainly would have heard about that by now after all these years. But that does bring Joan's work right up to the present moment here, as we think about all the things that have been in the headlines in recent weeks about polling places being closed and how the pandemic is maybe affecting people's willingness to vote in person. As we think about the stories we've had about purging of voting rolls in some states, something that has not happened in Minnesota, thank goodness, but is a problem right next door in Wisconsin, where you have same-day registration, as we do. People, if they show up and find there's a problem with their registration, can make the correction. But if you're voting by mail, it's a slower process to do that. Mm-hmm. So all these things are right up to the minute.
They are. And I'm thinking, Joan, too, how do we keep making Minnesota the state that votes?
How do we keep that record?
Yeah.
I think we have to be extremely diligent with the system that we have now. Every year, it seems that someone wants to do away with election day registration. And so we can't sit back and rest and think, oh boy, we have this form, now we don't have to worry about it. We do have to worry about it. And I think everyone needs to look around and see what is happening in some of these other states and do the best they can to counteract some of those falsehoods that are out there. But it takes diligence, it takes people wanting to vote, but we can look to the future a bit. Once we get through this pandemic, we can look to the future and hopefully we can make some quite dramatic changes, such as automatic voter registration or motor voter part 2, if you will, where you can get a registration card, you're given one wherever you interact with the state office. There are many, many more proposals that I hope will come before the legislature, and I hope the governor will sign them, because they would really improve it. And it is our job. And it was always our philosophy and our value system in the office to say that people have a right to vote. It is not a privilege that we grant them. They have a right to vote, and it is our job as election administrators to help them carry out that right.
Well, Lori, before we get into questions, I'm wondering, as you and Joan were working on the book, did you realize how relevant it would be today?
Well, we're very glad, hopeful, all the while we're working on this book, that we could release it in connection with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, because it does really underscore the point. I'm so glad that the nation's attention has been drawn to this anniversary celebration. The right to vote that women obtained through the 19th Amendment was not something granted to them by a benevolent man. It was the result of a 75-year struggle. That it was an intense struggle involving women being jailed and force-fed and putting a great deal of difficult effort into achieving this thing. And being reminded of that, I think, helps us appreciate what we have here as an opportunity to help control our shared lives. It's an important part of our heritage in Minnesota and something we ought to prize and try to enhance.
Well said. Thank you both. And I know we have a lot of people waiting to ask questions. So if you want to give me the first question, we'll get ready. All right. Our first questioner is asking, did more women turn out to vote in Joan's district the year she won? So anybody want to take that?
Yeah. You know, I don't know the answer to that question, because I don't think in 1972 we had the infrastructure to tell if they were men or women who were voting. or if they did, I didn't know. I know there were more women voted or not. I just don't know. It would be fun to find out.
Yeah, one of the difficulties we had in doing research is that a lot of the statistics sort of start after we established our sort of statewide voter registration system in 1973. So the 74 election is sort of the beginning point. It's why I'm able to say that Minnesota led the nation in presidential turnout, presidential years from the 1976 election forward. 10 of the last 12 presidential elections. We might have led the nation before that, but we don't really know for sure.
I have no idea. It was in the olden days, you know, Michelle.
We do know the first woman who voted was from Minnesota too in 1920, right?
Yes. That was a very carefully staged election in South St. Paul, Minnesota.
Right. We gotta recognize that, our Marguerite Newbert, right?
Got lots of national attention from Minnesota that day.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. All right, this is from Mindy Greiling. We can all say hi to Mindy. How did Joan and Lori work together on the book?
We worked. I'll start. You can finish, Lori. We worked quickly. We were under a deadline, and thankfully, we got the book completed and being sent to the editor. I think just about a week before the pandemic hit, didn't we, Lori?
Yes. I mean, that was, of course, by coincidence that we beat the pandemic. But we just did.
Planned on the pandemic, but the Historical Society wanted to get the book out before the election this year, and
we did too.
This particular date. Yes, we did too. So Lori was kind of the organizer, and she would, we'd sit in the same room, we'd decide what the topics were going to be, kind of divided them into chapters. We both did some research. I had scrapbooks that my mother had kept. She probably had 25 scrapbooks. And she started when I was first elected, and anytime she saw my name or my photo in the paper, she clipped it out and put it in a scrapbook. Now, none of these had any information about where or when it was, but she did have all this material. So we hauled all these scrapbooks in from my storage locker. We went through those and we remembered some things, and I saw some clippings I hadn't really seen before, but we just worked it out. And Lori would say, now think about this topic. And she'd say, no, you've got to think about this, and next week when we get together, we're going to talk about that. And Lori is the best I've ever seen.
Oh, thank you.
She would type, and then we go back and clean it all up again.
Fabulous.
It was a great pleasure to work with you, Joan, and those scrapbooks by your mother, whose nickname was Brownie.
Yes.
We owe Brownie a byline on the front cover of this book because her scrapbooks were a great help to us.
Right.
That's great. All right, next question. All right, is Minnetonka and Edina, are they still a rivalry?
Minnetonka and Edina, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they are with sports teams. I know that Did Creek that long ago was actually half of the city of Minnetonka and all of Eden Prairie.
Yes.
So it was fairly rural when I ran. I mean, I had to have someone drive me sometimes from ranch to ranch or farm to farm. But I just don't know if they still have any rivalry.
We should note that area was, when Joan ran, considered pretty safe Republican territory. And Joan ran for the legislature in 1972, the last year when we did not have party designation on the ballot. So it was just her name without a party label following it. She had sat right along. She was intended to caucus with the Liberals, who were in the process of calling themselves the DFL caucus in the House. But that was not something that was on the ballot. By 1974, had she run for re-election in 74, she would have had DFL after her name. That area, by the way, today, I believe, is represented mostly by DFLers.
I think you're right, Lori. I think it has changed a lot. And we made such a point of, on every piece of literature and every lawn sign, we put Democrat, so that people knew, so they weren't accusing me of being something I wasn't, but there was no party designation.
Interesting, great stories. All right, any other questions from our Facebook Live audience here tonight? All right, here's one. Joan, any thoughts about lowering the voting age to 16? You can drive a car at 16.
Yes, I know that. I think I think the truth of the matter is that some people would be eligible to vote at 16 or 18 or 20 or 40. Some would not. And the same is true that some of these folks who are voting now would really not be eligible to vote if we looked at it when they're 40 or 50 or 60. I mean, there are people you think just don't look into things.
No, Joan, we're in favor of voting. Remember that.
That's right, we are, but some of them just don't know what they're doing. But I don't know. I remember arguing a point about that when they were talking about lowering the age for young people to have alcohol and beer. And I think the legislature had lowered it perhaps before I joined. Laura, you might know this history better than I do. But we ended up, I think, voting to raise that because they said, no, this is, and the argument was the same as voting. These young people can be drafted. They are considered adults at 18. They can buy a house. They can have a credit card. So they should be able to have the full range of things. But I think that it would be a subject I don't want to tackle because it's extremely controversial. And I figured other things would more benefit the electorate than that.
Well, Joan's colleague in the Minnesota House class of 1972, Phyllis Kahn, was for all her 44 years in the legislature a huge champion of reducing the voting age to 16. Introduced that bill every session, and I think she might have had a hearing a few times. I don't know that that bill ever advanced. Nevertheless, there is something to be said for tying the first voting experience to a situation when people are all still in school and are taking government classes and can have the training right there in their high schools and the voter registration opportunity right there in their high schools. And as Minnesota has now, I believe, increased the mandatory age for high school attendance through age 18. So those 16-year-olds would be in high school when they cast their first ballots.
And we know we're certainly working, Wings is working still all around the state to help continue to educate our high schoolers and all of us, right, on those critical issues of democracy. It's an ever-growing task, for sure.
Yes, and it's difficult. We had a program that we would send out a lesson plan to civics, history, government teachers, and the final day of the lesson, it was like 3 or 4 days or something, was the fact that they would register. They weren't eligible to vote yet, but they would register and turn it in. And then when they became 18, then they could go vote. So it's an interesting thought. I'll have to think about that. I know so many 16-year-olds who are interested in politics. They're interested in government. They're interested in change. I don't know if there's an opening for that to be passed.
Lots on our plate. All right, I'm told we have a few more questions. So here's one from someone age 17. Maxine Moore says, this is so inspirational. What advice do you give for our next generation of voters? Another simple question, you know.
Maxine, I would say stay involved, stay interested, pay attention, and assume responsibility. And I see young people doing that. You absolutely can make a difference, especially joining with other people in whatever cause or passion you have. And when you're 18, you can vote. But I would also suggest that you, if you're really interested in politics and public office, you try to get an internship with someone who is in office. Follow them around for a day. See if this is something you'd really like. But I just want to do anything I can to encourage young people to be involved, to keep up our voter participation rate.
Excellent. All right. I know we have a couple more questions. Any comment on the political compromise that led to mail balloting as an option only for rural areas? I don't know. Lori, do you want to talk about that?
Well, Joan may remember that history better than I do, because by that time I was not at the Capitol as a reporter, but I was an assignment editor back in the newsroom asking our reporters to follow that bill in 1987 that Joan was pushing. The thought was that election administration was expensive in those sparsely populated counties and involved a good deal of travel time for voters, sometimes having to arrange to travel with small children in tow, or for elderly people to have to drive long distances. So the legislature was willing to bend its otherwise resistant attitude when it came just to those sparsely populated counties, but that was as far as they would go. And when they first put that opportunity there, it was as a trial, a trial that became permanent, but was not expanded in Minnesota. It's among the pieces of unfinished business from Joan's era, and it speaks to a point that she made earlier. Legislators have all succeeded under the rules that exist now. The status quo is what got them there, and they're very reluctant to change those rules.
Yeah, very good. Oh, one last question I think we can put in. In your years as Secretary of State, Joan, did you see cases of election fraud? If so, what kind?
We really did not see cases of election fraud. Minnesota has not had what I would call election fraud. One thing, there's a very serious penalty for it. It is a felony. And I think that stories that you hear are really totally false. There have been national studies that show that there hasn't been election fraud in this country. Now, we did get, the county attorneys are required by law, and we put that provision into the law because in rural areas, some county attorneys, we thought, well, maybe they're reluctant to report someone. So county attorneys are required to handle any cases and pursue them that are brought to their attention relating to election law. And I remember a case in Minneapolis where this man walked into this polling place and he voted. And as he walked out, the election judge said to him, "Oh, Mr. Jones," whatever his name was, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have let you vote here. You're supposed to be voting down at Emerson School. Oh, he said, that's okay. So he went out the door and went down to Emerson School to vote, not realizing that his vote wasn't canceled in the first place. Well, they caught him. I mean, and when he gave that explanation, you think, well, that wasn't his fault. But the studies have shown that people do not falsely identify themselves to come and vote when they're not supposed to. They do not take on another identification to try to vote twice. So I feel really confident about the voting system in Minnesota. And we have such good election judges and election administrators that they keep tabs on things, and they don't want that to happen either. So I feel confident about the voting process in the state.
Excellent. Well, we have an encore question here. I thought we were done, but like any good event, we need an encore. So, all right. So what is your hope for young women in this November election who may be voting for the first time this year? You want to take that, Joan?
I will. My hope is that they don't get discouraged. Yes. My hope is that if they vote for someone who doesn't win, whether it's a legislative race or a local race or a presidential race, that they don't get discouraged and say, well, that didn't do any good. I'm not doing that again. You don't and are unable to make any change unless you stay with what you're doing and stay involved. And so I think that would be it. I would also encourage these young women or young people in general, to encourage your friends, your neighbors, your schoolmates, to go vote and to show them that it does make a difference. That's the hope of our future, Michelle. That is the hope of our future.
How about you, Lori?
Well, I think that's a very good answer. And I would just add, don't give in to cynicism, because cynicism is a tool of those who would like to diminish our democracy. Mm-hmm. Don't give in to the idea that our voting doesn't matter, that this doesn't count, that nothing will change with our votes. That's a cynical attitude that's being touted by some who are actually trying to deprive us of our power. Believe in democracy, and you'll have, I think, a good outcome.
Right. And you can, excuse me, Michelle, you just can look around the country and you see where people are being denied the vote. And it happens over and over. And sometimes it's election administrators, sometimes it's the laws in the state. But I think we should be putting as much energy and focus into encouraging people to vote, making it easier for them to vote than we do into worrying about someone who might cast a fraudulent ballot.
A fabulous way to end. I want to thank you so much for writing this great book that I'm confident will become a bestseller among those of us who care about our democracy and are also very interested in beautifully written memoirs, which this is. And of course, I also want to put a plug in for another great opening today. The Minnesota Historical Society launched Votes for Women, an online exhibit at mnhs.org/votesforwomen. Developed in partnership with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota, this exhibit shares the stories of more than 40 amazing Minnesota women whose commitment to civic responsibility, as well as the many voices who have been left out, can inspire us to participate more fully in the democratic process. So let's turn out, everyone, and thank you all for tuning in to our event tonight. It's been just a joy, and everyone get your books before they're out.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.